Hi, Malika, can you hear?
All right. Hello, everyone. We want to get started. So first of all, I would like to congratulate our colleagues from Norway. Confident to continue to advocate for the Council. Now to a few teachers this morning. So some those who were here yesterday, just for this morning. So if there is French and English, just the of your options. So everyone is automatically muted. An intervention question muted to questions. If you have a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A function. The chief of today as well for the away with attendees. In terms of settings, there's a button. So for the two, make sure that so just click on the drop-down menu, select all panel attendees. So this way everyone can see your comments. If we get, if there's a technical issue, if you get disconnected or we need to turn off the webinar, please reconnect using the same dial-in information, so the same ID and password through the same link. If there are any issues, we will send you a new link to the email that you provided through Eventbrite. Great.
Katerina, on technical issues, there might be one at your end, just to flag to you. We're getting a message saying your network bandwidth is low and the audio and the video is going in and out.
This is better. For communication. I don't know if maybe It's probably poor connection on my end. I'm grateful if Kara can just do this. Thank you.
So hi, everybody. Let's see if this works. It's Joan from the Women's Refugee Commission. If you have problems hearing me, let me know, and I'll try to stop my video and just talk. Okay, looks like I'm getting some good, okay. So we'll take it from the top. Katerina had some housekeeping things related to your video and audio and all of that. Which we can come back later to. I think what we'll do is just begin the session now, and then we can see if we have some technical things we need to clean up in due course. So, like, first of all, good morning, afternoon, probably early evening, I know, to some colleagues, and I just hope everybody's back with lots of energy, and we really need your good thinking today, right, for this session. So it's devoted to strengthening the implementation of call to action in the field. That's what we're going to spend the morning on. And I think we all know, we've talked about it numerous times, that implementing the call to action with our field-based colleagues, with humanitarian leadership, with our national and local partners is really essential to sustainability and success of our work. And we also know we've got a heck of a lot to do in this area, right? Both within our own organizations, with field-based leadership, and certainly in partnership with our national and local organizations. So the Women's Refugee Commission, with support from the Government of Canada, was asked to draft a field implementation strategy for the partnership that we could all take forward together. So a chunk of the time today will be spent on discussing that draft together. There's an initial discussion draft. We'll have a good time to look at each piece of it and see if it makes sense from the point of view of all of you, and then we can finalize it after this meeting. But first, the first thing we're going to do is start with a session on the Gbv Accountability Framework. And if you had a chance to look at the field strategy beforehand, you know that the Gbv Accountability Framework is a key component within that overall strategy. So we wanted to make sure that every colleague on the call today in this meeting was briefed on the accountability framework. Some of you were at the meeting last year and will be familiar with it, but I think we have a chance to go into more detail on it this time round. And just to say quickly, what the accountability framework does is it lays out the specific actions that field level humanitarian actors, particularly leadership, have to do to prioritize GBV prevention and response. And we've sometimes said that if you think about the global call to action roadmap as the what, then in some ways the accountability framework can be considered the how. And I think for all of us, it's a really practical resource for strengthening field implementation. And I think it's going to be really helpful to all of us as we make our new commitments under the updated roadmap. I think it will help us make better, stronger, more measurable commitments. So with that, I'm going to introduce you all to Katya Villanueva from the Norwegian Refugee Council, and she's going to go ahead, hey Katya, she's going to go ahead and shepherd us through this session and discussion. So thanks everybody, and good morning, afternoon, and evening again.
Thank you very much, Joan. Allow me please to share my screen with all of you because we have a presentation for you. So let me know if you can see my screen now.
Yes, we can see it, Katya.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's a bit of a challenge with all these multiple tools right now. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today, and welcome to this briefing session on the Gbv Accountability Framework. The Real-Time Accountability Partnership, or RTAP, seeks to translate humanitarian commitments on Gbv into concrete actions that will lead to results, mainly on improving funding, better coordination, and more effective programming. The members of the steering committee of the RTAP are working together to translate these high-level commitments on Gbv into action at field level and promote a system-wide accountability for prevention and response for Gbv in emergencies. So our goal in this session, as mentioned before by Joan, is to emphasize the utility of the Gbv Accountability Framework as a tool that will help all of us meet the six call to action roadmap outcomes. All right, then allow me to present to you what is the proposed agenda for this brief session. We will have an overview of the Gbv Accountability Framework, followed by an intervention presenting the utility of the Accountability Framework to you, precisely how can this tool help craft and meet the call to action commitments. Followed by a session on catalyzing the field implementation of the call to action with some examples and contributions from colleagues from the field. Excellent. And here I will just introduce the Accountability Framework very briefly. It is a multi-stakeholder initiative developed by a group of call to action partners, aiming to ensure that all humanitarian actors in the field prioritize, integrate prevention of and response to Gbv across all sectors, from the outset of an emergency, in a coordinated manner across all humanitarian assistance and protection actions, and across all stages of the humanitarian response. We are aiming at improving preparedness, ensuring that there's needs assessment conducted, that the response is strategic, and resource mobilization is aligned and following on the needs from the field, and that we ensure implementation and monitoring. The link to be able to download the accountability framework is being posted right now by my colleagues in the chat, so you can follow that there. I can also mention that the accountability framework can also be found in additional languages. We have links to the French, Spanish, and Arabic versions. Dari and Pashto versions are in development right now. The links to these different languages can be found in the chat box right now. Then we would like to give you a snapshot on what was the process of development of the accountability framework. You can see that in 2017, the Real-Time Accountability Partnership launched the Gbv Accountability Framework. And between 2017 and 2018, the RTAP focused on targeted implementation and evaluation of this Gbv Accountability Framework, focusing on 2 pilots in Iraq and South Sudan. And by November of 2018, the Accountability Framework was endorsed as a central tool to reinforce the call to action in the field and at the Call to Action Global Steering Committee meeting. From 2019 and onwards, we have continued disseminating the Accountability Framework. The pilot aim line was evaluated, and the lessons learned and recommendations have been taken forward by the Steering Committee of the RTAP. I will now hand over to Dina, who is taking over from me to continue the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katya, for the great introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone wherever you are. This is Dina from CARE, based in Washington, DC. And in this section of the presentation, we will just jump right into discussing how the Gbv Accountability Framework can really help craft and meet call to action commitments. In a nutshell, the key takeaway from this component of the session just revolves around gaining a better understanding of the utility of the Gbv Accountability Framework, of course, in the context of the new call to action roadmap. Something you will often hear us say is that if the call to action roadmap is the what that we as partners want to achieve, then the Gbv Accountability Framework is how we achieve it. And as we go through this portion of the session, I would recommend that you keep this specific framing in mind, just as we pull together all these pieces. We will now just jump right into explaining the how. Next slide, please. So the Gbv Accountability Framework, really in all of its components, from preparedness to needs assessment to resource mobilization and beyond, is a tool that will help realizing call to action commitments. And this is by transforming high-level commitments into very specific actions taken up by humanitarian leadership at both the global level and, importantly, at the field level. As you can see on this slide, the Gbv Accountability Framework is categorically divided to really show and describe specific action points for a number of diverse stakeholders. This includes, but is not limited to, donors, HCTs, Gbv mainstreaming agencies, specialized agencies, just to name a few. And here you will notice that the Gbv Accountability Framework goes beyond specialized Gbv actors. For instance, specific actions for donors across different stages of the humanitarian cycle line up really nicely with key action areas in the new call to action roadmap. And so in essence, they're a path to crafting and meeting specific call to action commitments. Next slide, please. So I think this really brings us to discussing the utility of the Gbv Accountability Framework in operationalizing call to action implementation in the field. And here I think it's critical to note that the Gbv Accountability Framework as a tool has intricately informed the development of the new call to action roadmap. The good news attached to this piece of information, and something that would greatly benefit you and your team, is that actions in the Gbv Accountability Framework are then directly linked to specific call to action key outcome areas. And while the focus of this slide really revolves around the utility of the accountability framework in crafting and meeting commitments at the field level, I think here it's also important to note, and while this isn't something that we talk about often, it's also critical to mention that there is a need for global policies to really reinforce the validated actions in the accountability framework, even when we are specifically thinking about field implementation. Next slide, please. So building on the information we shared today, our goal as the Gbv Accountability Framework Global Steering Committee is to help you think a bit more deeply and concretely about how the Gbv Accountability Framework as a tool can really help you in crafting and meeting call to action commitments. In your capacity, you can use the Gbv Accountability Framework to establish specific actions under key outcome areas in the new roadmap, hence developing and later meeting call to action commitments. We would encourage you to initiate conversations within your team and with your colleagues to discuss how to advance collective accountability on Gbv at the field level, aided by the Gbv Accountability Framework and in the context of the new roadmap. So the Gbv Accountability Framework Global Steering Committee, which brings together INGOs, UN agencies, donors, and beyond, would be happy to provide support on crafting commitments that are in line with the accountability framework over the few coming weeks. I will pop in the contact information in the chat box, but to make this all a lot more concrete, my colleague Erin will take us through a few examples. Erin, over to you.
Thanks, Dina. So good morning, everybody. My name is Erin Patrick. I'm the Global Coordinator for the ISC GBV Guidelines. Yeah, Katya, if you could go to the next slide, please. Thanks. I am just going to walk us through a little bit of what this might look like. So I know we've been talking kind of at a little bit 10,000 foot level about the accountability framework and how it can help you with making your commitments or informing the commitments that you're making. So I'm going to try to make that a little bit more tangible. I've selected just a few examples here. Obviously, we're not going to go into all the detail, but I just want to try to show you how you could use the specific actions in the accountability framework to inform commitment making. And one of the things that I want to preface this by saying that I know we heard with the first global roadmap that there was some people had difficulty kind of translating the language in the first roadmap to the field level, and that it was very, kind of assumed a global a global role, and that it was hard sometimes for field actors to see themselves specifically in the roadmap. And so what we're trying to do now is to show you how you can use the accountability framework, which is really geared much more towards a field audience, to inform commitments. Now, whether those are commitments that are being made at country level or regional office level or global level, or are being made at global level in a way that they can also be implemented at field level. Obviously, every organization, every call to action member is going to have a slightly different way of going about it. But so we just want to give you an idea of how you can do that. So what we've done is kind of mapped how the revised roadmap and the accountability framework come together. So this first example I'm going to give is from outcome 4 in the roadmap, which is the funding related outcome. So one of the key action areas in the roadmap is it's 4.3. It's focused on localization. And so it says, provide local actors, particularly women's organizations, with sufficient funding for GBV and gender equality work during every phase of emergency response. This is, those of you that were on the call yesterday will remember that we talked actually quite a lot about this. So the activity that's in the GBV accountability framework, you'll find there's many, right? This is just one example, is in the donors column. So it really shows you, the accountability framework shows you not just the how, but also the who. Every column has a specific type of actor attached to it. So in the donors column of the accountability framework, there's a recommended action to allocate resources to strengthen emergency response capacity of local organizations and women's groups. So we can see that those two are obviously already completely in alignment, right? Which is great. But what does that mean? So what I wanted to do here in the final column, the rightmost column, is an example commitment. So how could we take the information or the guidance that's in the accountability framework that fully supports the key action area in the roadmap to actually make a commitment that achieves the outcome? This is just an example, right? And it actually, came based on the conversation we had yesterday, but we could consider actually making even a collective commitment. So this could be, for example, a collective commitment by donors to establish a pooled fund in X number of countries that can be accessed only or primarily by women-led or women's rights organizations. Right, so that's some commitment related language. It's obviously not meant to be, final or anything, but that's what a commitment could look like. That is directly in line with the recommended action in the accountability framework that will help us to achieve the localization KAA in the roadmap. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is outcome 5 in the roadmap, which is specialized GBV programming. I just picked one of the KAAs, 5.7, which is advocacy. And that KAA says advocate for funding to implement specialized GBV services. I summarized it. The corresponding activity in the accountability framework is advocate about the needs and priorities of women and girls in bilateral meetings, interagency fora, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, fully in line with each other, right? But what does that mean? So again, I thought of a potential collective commitment. Now, of course, these could be easily translated into individual member agency commitments as well. But we could use the call to action platform, and I'll get to the reason there's an asterisk there in a second. We could use the call to action platform to collectively identify key advocacy targets and develop joint messaging on GBV for each new emergency. This is quite similar to what we did for the GHRP, right, which we discussed yesterday. But my question to you, which we can discuss in a minute, is when we say, use the call to action platform, there's obviously different iterations of the call to action platform, right? And I'd be interested to speak with you and hear from you about what using the call to action platform might look like if we're talking about, global level partners, field level partners, and how the flow of information is going back and forth. I mean, I could see it in a way that the field is filtering the information up to the global level, which is then, collating that information to do high-level advocacy with, UN, with heads of agencies, with key donors, etc. But it would be interesting also to talk through what that could look like at field level. If we have, a country where there's multiple call to action members that are active in the same emergency, how could we potentially use the call to action platform at the field level as well? And then the last example, if you could go to the next slide, please, is risk mitigation. So that's outcome 6 in the roadmap. One of the KAAs, 6.1, is focused on institutionalization, and that says institutionalize GBV risk identification into sectoral and intersectoral tools, standards, processes, et cetera, across all sectors and in all phases of the response. The corresponding activity in the accountability framework says that agencies with responsibility to mainstream GBV, which is every agency, can integrate GBV risk mitigation in line with relevant sections of the guidelines into their agency response plans and programming. So again, fully in line with each other, the roadmap and the accountability framework. So what could a collective commitment potentially look like here? Actually, this shouldn't be collective commitment. This is actually a potential individual agency commitment. I wanted to have one that's not collective. So forget the word collective there. So as the lead of X cluster, so this could be, any cluster lead agency, whether it's, Unicef or IOM or UNHCR, whatever, could say that we, as the cluster lead agency, will ensure that 100% of all of our HRP submissions for our cluster will include some level of analysis of sector-specific GBV risks with corresponding risk mitigation actions, right? I know 100% is a pretty high target there, but I'm hoping we can think big. So that would be one example at the sort of response planning level. But if we're not talking about cluster agencies, or we're not talking about response planning, we're talking about more, specific direct programming. There's another example there, which would be X agency, so fill in the blank, whatever call to action member agency, commits to ensuring that all of our project proposals, regardless of focus sector, so if it's a nutrition or a food security or WASH proposal, will include sector-specific GBV risk analysis and mitigation plans. So these are, again, just very quick examples of how we can make, whether individual member agency or collective.
Hi, Erin. Sorry to jump in. We're just having some trouble seeing the slide. Would you be willing to turn your video off to see if that will bring the slide back up? Does that help, folks? Okay, it's fine now. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No worries. Sorry. I wasn't looking at the chat while I was talking. Anyway, I was pretty much done. So I just wanted to say that these are just, again, examples from, as you saw, just a few outcomes and just a few key action areas. But I hope that it gives you a sense of how you might be able to think about using the accountability framework to craft your commitments under really any outcome or any KAA, because, as we said in a previous slide, they do all line up. All the outcome areas have been fully informed by the accountability framework and vice versa. So I'm going to hand it over now. I believe Christine from Unicef is next.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, I can.
Okay, great. Thanks, Erin, and thanks to everyone for the intro presentations. Actually, Erin, your last slide feeds in so nicely to what I was going to talk about, so that's perfect. So I think from the Unicef side, we've been part of the accountability framework since the beginning. And just in terms of what we've seen, mainly from the pilot in South Sudan, also in Iraq, but I would say to a larger extent in South Sudan, is that it really gave our GBV specialists, something tangible that they could take and have really meaningful, concrete conversations within Unicef and within other sectors and clusters that we lead in a way that made sense to them and that made them just be able to pick it up and run with it. And so at a technical level, I think we really saw that as a huge benefit, similar to what Erin was describing in the last slide, but also it created the opportunity to have those conversations with management in a way that felt accessible and made our management feel confident going to the HCT meetings and really being a consistent advocate on GBV in ways that I think hadn't quite felt as accessible as in the past. So, they had something they could hold on to, and they could go to these HCT meetings and say, look, this is something that we're all responsible for. We feel confident standing behind this, and we can talk about it in a way that's concrete and tangible and not sort of get into the space that, we might be asked questions that we don't really feel like we can handle, or, get into complex issues around mandate or anything like that, but really just, this is everyone's accountability, this is our responsibility, and this is how it lays out within the system. And so it was just a way to kind of, I think, demystify the conversation for people that aren't constantly involved in talking about GBV and really help them see how it's relevant to their work and help them become a more effective advocate within the work that they do. I'll leave it there and let others jump in.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, I'm just going to speak for just a minute and I guess provide the testimony. I know Erin mentioned the need for supportive policies coming from the regional or the global level to implement the accountability framework. I'll give one very recent example from UNFPA, not so much about enforcing it on the country level, but something that was very useful for us in crafting a quick guidance note for our in-country leadership on GBV and COVID was using some of the actions from the accountability framework, specifically those in the HCT column, and combining those with some other actions from our internal SOP was really useful to present to our leadership in country how to present and how to lead on GBV and COVID-19. So that was something that was very useful regarding, keeping it as an agenda item and what to present. While these issues, should be always there, we adapted it specifically to COVID with key messages on GBV and COVID. So that was something that was very useful for UNFPA and demonstrates the utility of the accountability framework's actions for a specific subset of our staff. Also just want to briefly mention, I know that we didn't go too much into the pilots, but the South Sudan pilot for the year of the pilot had a focal points working group, of course. That group has recently revived themselves on their own and debranded themselves, which is great, and renamed themselves the GBV and Gender Accountability Framework Partnership, which is great. And they've still are focusing on sort of the subset of accountability framework actions and checking in with each other and holding themselves accountable and how they're doing as a collective to uphold those actions. And they've also added a column on intercluster work, which is great because it's very focused on what's needed in that context. So I'll hand it over to Liz from BHA.
Hi, everyone. This is Liz Pender. I don't really, there isn't, it's very early where I am. I'm sorry, it's 5:30 in the morning. So the real-time accountability framework is in many ways, in its entirety, the way that OFTA, now Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, is realizing all of its commitments to the call to action. And when we created, in partnership with the others mentioned on the first slide, the real-time accountability partnership, it was so that we could essentially hold ourselves accountable to key actions and also support and fund other partners with consolidating key actions in creating a tool that would hold that collective partnership accountable to the commitments made at call to action. So we really refer to the Gbv Accountability Framework as kind of our flagship mechanism for realizing the 10 commitments that we made to call to action. And I'm really consistently using it in my own advocacy with senior leadership. When I give briefings to Congress or the Senate, I am referencing the Real-Time Accountability Partnership. And I think what in particular resonates and has continued to resonate with my own leadership is this idea of collective action and collective accountability, and the fact that we have not only pulled all of these actions together by categorical group, but have also shown that each action is interdependent, and that if the donors are not, if the humanitarian coordinator, for example, does not meet his or her commitments or is not accountable to his or her key actions, then even if donors want to fund and want to increase funding, the system fails, right? Or even if partners want, even if service providers on the ground are on the ground and donors want to fund those service providers, if it has not been prioritized by the humanitarian coordinator, the system in its entirety will fail. So that particular aspect and element of the accountability framework has really changed the narrative within often BHA, and in fact has meant that every year since the genesis of the call to action, and every year since the Real-Time Accountability Partnership was created, BHA has substantively increased its GBV funding by at least 10 to 15% each year, and this last year by 23%. So it's really, really been instrumental in certainly in BHA's efforts. Over.
Thanks, Liz. This is Louise from IOM. Many thanks for the opportunity to lend IOM's voice here in this forum to highlight the impact of the accountability framework and how it has strengthened the commitment made at the organizational level. Yeah, so thanks for the opportunity. I've recently joined IOM in the capacity of GBV specialist, so this is my first annual meeting to attend. But since joining, I've been really impressed by the efforts made by IOM to institutionalize GBV across all departments and sectors, which my predecessor has confirmed is largely a result of the concrete guidance provided within the accountability framework on how to achieve and realize this in practice. So I wanted to just provide a few brief examples of how the accountability framework was used to institutionalize and operationalize efforts to better address GBV and crisis within IOM. So the framework, and in particular the theory of change that underpins it, informed the development of IOM's GBV and crisis operational model, and which I think we can also share in the forum. This model sets out essential actions for IOM programs to undertake and address GBV. The model utilizes the actions in the GBV accountability framework to ensure that GBV considerations, in particular risk mitigation activities, are integrated across IOM's crisis programming. At the same time, the framework is also informing the development of an institutional accountability document for the implementation of our GBV operational model, which clarifies internal roles and responsibilities and provides guidance to all leadership levels on how to better address GBV. In line with the accountability framework, IOM has also developed a mission-wide measurable action plan in 3 countries so far, including Nigeria, South Sudan, and Bangladesh, to ensure country commitments to implementing concrete actions to better address GBV. So these were some few examples in the brief time we had. I hope these examples and our testimony adequately highlight the critical role the accountability framework has served in guiding IOM's progress on addressing GBV in crisis. Thanks again for the opportunity. I think from the slide I was the last testimony, so I'll leave it there and open up for any questions.
Great, thanks, Louise. Just to flag while people are putting their questions together, for information to request further discussions, or as Nina's requested, a workshop or a facilitated session on how teams can use the Gbv Accountability Framework. Here's the email at the center of the slide that you're looking at. Feel free to put your hands up if you'd like to say something either about your experience using the Gbv Accountability Framework or questions you have based on the presentation. We don't have anything raised in the Q&A, but invite people to ask questions that way if you're interested, and then also to flag that we have posts on the forum as well, that it would be really great to hear from people in response to how else we can continue to make the accountability framework as accessible as possible, to share the learning and the evidence and the good practice from the agencies that are already using it and in the pilot contexts. So I'm just looking through, there was a question from Fatima previously on why the Gbv Accountability Framework was piloted in different countries. And that was actually because the pilots for the Gbv Accountability Framework were selected before the call to action pilots were selected. So whilst they are now integrated together, they started out as two different initiatives. And so there was a baseline study for the Gbv Accountability Framework conducted in 5 contexts, and then we chose the pilot context from those. I'm just looking to see if there are any hands raised among participants. I don't see any. We do have a few more minutes to be able to either hear more questions or have a further discussion, as we started a little late for this session. I mean, one of the questions that I would certainly be interested to hear for colleagues who are at a subnational level or a national level in the field is how useful this can be in terms of, and how it fits into the coordination that you imagine doing with other signatories of the call to action in your context. Because in the case of the pilots in Iraq and South Sudan, we actually developed an in-country steering committee. But of course, as you'll see in the field implementation session, which is coming next, we're trying to use the coordination structures that already exist when it comes to implementing the 2021-2025 global roadmap. And so looking at whether, for example, in IDP contexts and mixed settings, the GBV subcluster is an already existing coordination structure that we could use and build on to ensure that we're coordinating among call to action signatories at country level, particularly in focus countries that we may identify as call to action signatories, to try to focus our energies and being able to measure progress and build good practice as a catalyst for further development elsewhere. I see a question from Alia. Thanks, Alia, about the further reading material, which we can provide both in terms of the framework itself and the findings from the pilot studies. And it raised a really good question as well, Alia, on how the country level agencies, or perhaps a group of country agencies, can adapt the framework to the country context. So we have the good practice shared by the country teams that worked on it in South Sudan and Iraq, whereby both of them began with the full Gbv Accountability Framework and then went through a workshop process. They contextualized it to the urgent needs and the priorities in the context. Thanks for those who are flagging hands raised. I see that we have Liz, and somebody's also mentioned that Laura Taylor is trying to speak. So I'll go to you, Liz, while I try to figure out who else. Over to you, Liz.
Hi, Joe. I just wanted, I just wanted to flag for you that there were some questions in the chat box and that it's not clear that the Q&A box works. And I saw Laura's question, which I thought was really an important one, but which in which we did highlight a little bit in the presentation, in which Erin answered. And I do just really want to reinforce that for those of you who are new members, or for those of you, which is all of us, who are updating and adapting our commitments to the call to action, a lot of that heavy lifting has already been done for you in the accountability framework. So I really encourage you to take a quick look at it. It's been updated and refined and adapted over the years, and always through the lens of how it aligns with and furthers the objectives of the call to action. Over.
Thanks, Liz. Also to point out that Erin is reposing the question that she asked during the part of the presentation in the chat box. So how might the use of the call to action platform inform, make or achieve commitments? How could that platform look different at the field and global level? And how do we connect the two? That is to say, how do we best work together between the global level and the field level in crafting and working towards implementation? And I see in the Q&A, we have people responding to the same question from Erin there. So interested to hear from folks. I know this was one of the things that I raised yesterday in the resource mobilization session again, and how we can really move forward using the good practice that was developed in Nigeria and DRC during the current roadmap, in that how we can build coordination at country level that is inclusive and that can bring together not only the call to action signatories at country level, but other organizations, particularly smaller and community-based organizations who perhaps aren't involved at the global level, but are leading the work at country level or at subnational level. And so how we manage to balance the accountability that we all share to each other as call to action signatories for living into our commitments and reporting on our progress, whilst not excluding the really dynamic work and the more sustained progress and engagement by local actors in the community, such as we saw in Nigeria and such as we saw in DRC, who added so much to the work being done in the country roadmap context.
Just really quickly, I just wanted to, because I don't know if you're tracking some of the chats while you're speaking, but Hen said that she has some examples of how the accountability framework is linked to the call to action. And I don't want to put her on the spot, but I know we only have a few minutes. So I don't know, Hen, if you wanted to share any of those.
Sure, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, terrific.
Okay, so the Women's Refugee Commission mapped the accountability framework actions to the key action areas in the new roadmap. the roadmap revision. And there was almost 100% match, which means that we could place almost every single one of the actions within the key action areas for the new roadmap. Again, that's not surprising because obviously we were closely looking at the accountability framework as we were working on the revision of the roadmap, because it is such a key component of the how, right, as has been said before. But one of the things that we're hoping to be able to share with folks is how they can utilize that mapping, right, of the accountability framework actions to the key action areas to help draft organizational commitments. As was demonstrated in the slideshow, there's a lot of room to do that. And we're hoping that as partners start to think about their commitments to the roadmap revision, that they really have a look at the accountability framework and use that as a way of helping them identify things that they can do. Over.
Thanks, Hen. We have Yusuf up next. Sorry, Yusuf, I'm trying to find you on the list so that I can allow permissions. Dina, do you have I think you're the host at the moment. Can you do the allow permission?
Has dropped off. It's probably connectivity issues, but I no longer see him in the list.
Okay, so it's not just me. Okay.
I'll keep an eye out.
Thanks. Any others who would like to come in with a question before? Oh, so Monique has raised a question. Does somebody who is bilingual want to help us with an English translation? I think we have our translator online.
I can give a hand, Joe, if you want.
Thanks.
Monique from Refed in DRC is asking if there is a possibility to share with them the experiences of others in relation to responsibilization on the implementation and the field implementation of the accountability framework.
Many thanks, Monique, and thanks also, Katya, for your help. So we can certainly share those, and I think we've had similar requests when we did a workshop, like as a training for DFID humanitarian advisors in December. We had similar requests from DFID on the Nigeria context, that can we actually focus on some intentional learning sharing and some discussions in Nigeria, and sounds similar to what you're asking, Monique, about doing in DRC, so that local organizations who've had the opportunity to engage through the call to action country pilots in those countries can also have an opportunity to look at how their experiences were mirrored or differed from experiences of local organizations engaging in the Gbv Accountability Framework pilots in South Sudan and Iraq. And as we mentioned before, we can share the findings from the evaluation of the pilots, which speaks to this also. Yusuf, I know you're back, so I'm going to give you the last word. If you'd still like to come in. I saw your hand oh so briefly and then it disappeared. Okay, he's gone again. Any final thoughts from any of my colleagues in the Global Steering Committee? Okay, well then.
Yes, thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, I just noticed that the Gbv Accountability Framework is still being translated into other languages, and I'm wondering if it is agreeable to the Forum for Clearview Integrity Foundation to help translate the Gbv Accountability Framework into the Hausa language, Hausa is one of the 3 major languages in Nigeria. And the 19 northern states especially, 19 out of 36 states speak Hausa fluently. And it is an area that has very high GBV cases. And Hausa is spoken all over the country, but especially in the 19 states out of the 36. So if it is agreeable, Clearview will be very happy to translate the framework into the Hausa language. Over.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that offer, Yusuf. This is certainly, now that we have French, Spanish, Arabic, and English have been completed, this is certainly our next direction, looking at languages like Hausa, like Amharic, Pashto and Dari, we already mentioned. And so we're very keen to work with GBV subcluster partners or GBV working group stakeholders at local level who are interested to utilize tools like the Gbv Accountability Framework so that we can work with stakeholders at country level on providing the technical support needed to develop additional translations. So thank you very much for raising that. I think we're now up to time. So I wanted to mention that we have a new coordinator coming on board for the Gbv Accountability Framework, who many of you may already know from her work with the Global Health Cluster and the Friends of Gender group. So I wanted to officially welcome Brianne Kaiser and thank her for being on the call today. And thanks to everybody for the time, and look forward to continuing this discussion as we go into the field implementation session next. Over to you, Joan.
Thank you, colleagues, very much for that briefing. I think it will be super helpful to us as we go into the next session on the field implementation strategy, because as I mentioned before, the accountability framework is such a key component of that. And thanks too to everybody who posed the good questions or made the comments. Before we go to a break, I think Kara from Canada wanted to say something. So Kara, I'll turn it over to you quickly.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kara Mitchell. I am Katarina's colleague from Global Affairs Canada. And so sorry about our rocky start this morning with our technical challenges. But at the top of the meeting, I wanted to reiterate what Katarina said, because I'm not sure everyone was able to hear. But we really wanted to congratulate our colleagues from Norway and Ireland on their election to the Security Council. Yesterday, we know that they put in a lot of work across their government to be successful in those seats. And we are certain that you will be great advocates for the protection of women and girls throughout the Council's agenda. So congratulations, great work. I also wanted to just flag for you one of the other administrative points that Katarina wanted to raise, which was if we experience unwanted interference during a call, we have a plan in place to shut the call down and send out immediately a new link. And what I'm referring to here is if we're hacked by chance, and we've recently experienced that in another call. So we have a plan in place, so we will action that quickly. I will ask and remind all attendees to try to change their name so we can see who everyone is on the call. And then the other point is just that we will return from the break at 9:15 sharp, so that's 15 minutes. And enjoy your coffee.
Thank you all. See you in 15 minutes. Okay, so Steve, here we are.
The meeting will resume in 2 minutes. Grateful if you could start making your way back to your screens.
So when do I, okay. Hi, everybody. I think we're back. Is that right? Hi. Hi, everyone. It's Joan from the Women's Refugee Commission. I think we're back. I hope everybody had their coffee or did a virtual energizer or something as we head into this next session. First, there's a housekeeping thing, which is apparently there are a couple people who were identified either just by a phone number or a series of letters. And so the request from Canada, given that there was interference in a past meeting, is that please identify yourself. Don't use your phone number or some kind of a code, but if you could please identify yourself by name, that would be great. I think that otherwise you may have to be removed from the meeting. So can I ask whoever has done that? And Kara, is there anything more to be said about that? Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, I'll just flag that I think for the phone numbers we're okay because folks dialing in by phone, they don't have a choice. But in particular, we have somebody who's joining us with the handle XXX. So for that individual, if you know who you are, it would be fantastic if you could let the rest of us know who you are. And that would be great. If not, we will look to remove you from the chat just out of prevention. Thanks a lot, Joan.
Okay, thanks everybody. And before we leap into this, I'm going to also introduce my colleague, Manisha Thomas. Manisha is the Women's Commission's Geneva representative. I think many of you know her either from work with the Women's Commission or other fora, or indeed last year's meeting where she was, she joined us as well. And so she's going to help me facilitate this discussion. I would just say at the very beginning, I mean, obviously, you know, people are comfortable in the chat, do use it, but I guess we would also request that if you can, hold your comments or questions until we get to the discussion period, because we'll have a lot of time for discussion, and I think it would be really great to hear from multiple voices during that period. So let me do the scary thing for me of sharing my screen. Let's see what happens here. Okay. Slideshow. What do I do after slideshow? Oh, there we go. Okay, hopefully you all can see my screen. That was my biggest anxiety of the day. Just to say before we get started, so as I said, this is meant to be a field implementation strategy for the Global Call to Action Partnership. And it's been drafted by the WRC, but it's really intended for everybody. It's been circulating in the partnership for a few months, but I think the reality is that given the time everybody had to give to either looking at the updated roadmap or all the incredible work that COVID has demanded of so many colleagues, or even just the day-to-day work responding to crises, we haven't had a large amount of feedback on it. And so this is really the chance to use today's meeting to really get your input. Does this strategy work for you? Do you have questions? As we go through it, please make notes to yourself along the lines of something seems to be missing, or I don't agree that that should be in there, or something's worded oddly, that kind of thing. What I'm going to do is go over the whole strategy first, and then we'll stop. We'll go back to each part and have a discussion on each part. So overview, and then back to say part one, stop for discussion facilitated by Manisha, move to the second part, and so on. So with that, you know, we said when we started our session today that implementation with our own field-based colleagues, local actors, absolutely essential to our sustainability and success. I think, you know, I sort of said to myself, this is really the moment. I mean, we've talked about it, we've done some important initial steps in piloting, but I think this is really the moment for several reasons. We have the launch of the updated roadmap coming up. As many of you know who've had a chance to look at it, there is an added emphasis on partnerships with national and local organizations, particularly women's organizations. And action on localization is included in every outcome of the updated roadmap. So I think that's really an opportunity here as we think about taking a field strategy forward. As I mentioned, we've already started doing some various pilot work that we can build on. So we have learning to draw from the call to action field level roadmap pilots in Northeast Nigeria and Democratic Republic of Congo. And when we get to those in the discussion period, it's great we have some colleagues on the call today who are very involved in the development of both those roadmaps. So we have the pilot call to action field level roadmaps, as I said, Northeast Nigeria, DRC. And we also had a series in 2018 of kind of call to action awareness raising workshops that were sponsored by the EU. And they occurred in 10 places across regions. So we'll come to that in a bit, but we also have learning from that. And then we also have, of course, as you just heard, both the learning and the opportunity that's represented by integrating the Gbv Accountability Framework into the call to action. Really a great opportunity for us. And just to say, in the coming slides, you'll see CTA, which is call to action, and AF, which is the accountability framework, and that's mainly because I was too lazy to type it out each time. So, okay, so the objectives of the strategy. I mean, there's three really. One is how do we strengthen uptake within our own call to action partner organizations? So most of us on this call are global partners. How do we really get institutionalization and uptake inside our organizations? That's part one. Part two is what kind of collective activities can we undertake as a partnership, maybe within our stakeholder groups or across them, to really strengthen implementation at the country and regional level. And then the third one is the steps we need to take to expand, deepen collaboration and partnership with local actors, particularly women's organizations. And the initial target audience or users for this strategy. So this is the first one that we've really tried to develop for the global partnership. So at least at the beginning, what we say in the draft is that the focal points for this strategy, that the main users for this strategy initially are the focal points of the call to action global partners and the global call to action stakeholder working groups. And part of the reason for that is that I think some of what we've learned in the early efforts is that to really get traction, to get going in a meaningful way on bringing the call to action to the field level in a way that it is well used and mutually beneficial, especially to local partners and colleagues, is that you really need a group of global champions working in partnership and collaboration with a group of field champions to move things forward. So at least in this first frame, we're thinking, what can we do as a global partnership to begin to get traction on this? And as you see at the bottom, it says it's a living document. And the reason for that is, in part, it's our first strategy. In part, I think we should be making this topic, field implementation, something, it's more than a topic, really. It's central to what we're trying to do. It ought to be addressed at every annual meeting. And presumably and hopefully, we're making progress in implementing the strategy so that we're looking at that progress at annual meetings, and then we can adjust the strategy based on what we're learning as we go. So I don't think it should be something that gets updated as needed. So part one is activities within our own organization. What can we do, as I say, as call to action global partners to really get uptake in our own organizations? And I think, you know, one of the things we know is that even now, it's not necessarily true that if we know that we're in call to action and we're working on it, it's not necessarily true that even the field-based colleagues of call to action partners know that their own organization is in the call to action. Or even if they know that, they might not know who all else is in the call to action. And if you don't know that, then I think in many ways we're really missing opportunities to advocate together, to act together, probably most importantly, to bring in our national partners into our field work in an even stronger way. So sort of step one is getting it better known, better institutionalized within our own organizations. So some of the suggestions you'll see there for part one, and again, think about this because we'll come back to it. Are these the right set of things? We can promote the updated roadmap. We have a great opportunity with the launch of the new roadmap. So can we, for example, start by engaging field staff in the development of the commitments that we make to the roadmap? Can we make sure that the updated roadmap is shared by our senior leadership, our heads of organization or whatever, with leadership in the field, so that you're making that link between the engagement of senior leadership at headquarters with senior leadership in the field around the call to action roadmap. I think we have opportunities within our own organizations to introduce and begin to integrate the accountability framework. And as we've heard before, we can use the accountability framework as well to shape our commitments under the new roadmap. We can share it with our field offices under the umbrella of call to action, opportunities like that. We could include call to action and the accountability framework on the agenda of the key convenings we have of field staff. So, for example, that might mean when you bring your regional leadership together for some reason. Annual meetings. I know a lot of country representatives, for example, get together within an organization for their annual meeting. Policy staff come together, technical staff come together within our own organizations. And so can we make sure that this is on the agenda of those convenings we do with our field staff? And then the last point is, under the call to action, every partner reports annually or should report annually. And can we use that process to get greater buy-in from our colleagues, both drawing information from them that informs our own individual reports, and then sharing our individual reports with our field colleagues. So those are just some examples of things we could start to do maybe more routinely and intentionally within our own organization to get better uptake. This next section, part two. Collective activities within and across stakeholder groups. And here I think there's a variety of things we could do. So for example, as the call to action within or across our stakeholder groups, IOs, NGOs, states and donors, we could advocate to integrate call to action, the accountability framework, and key humanitarian field guidance strategies meetings. So like, well, what's that? So I think, you know, it would be everything from HCT, meaning the Humanitarian Country Team, everything from the Humanitarian Country Team Centrality of Protection Strategies, to the Humanitarian Country Team compacts that guide how they do their work, to their annual meetings and retreats, to gatherings of cluster coordinators across different crises. If we could advocate to make sure that when those field kind of strategies and meetings always include something, an important element around call to action in the accountability framework. Promote call to action priorities in the humanitarian needs overview and humanitarian response processes. And this isn't to say that we would duplicate or in any way step on the work that I know many field colleagues already engage in quite heavily on this process. The annual humanitarian needs overview, the annual humanitarian response processes. But maybe what we could do as global focal points is develop messages that we can share across working groups. For example, states and donors could develop messages around the importance of ensuring that GBV, gender equality, are well represented in a country's HNO and HRP, and they could share that with their mission heads, for example, who in turn could advocate in country. Similarly, our international organizations colleagues, with support from all of us, could do the same thing with the different entities that lead the clusters or sectors, with the cluster coordinators and so on. So it's really thinking as global partners, is there advocacy messaging we develop and share with field colleagues who then take it up in their own country processes. And then I think there's all the opportunities around highlighting the efforts that are going on under the call to action umbrella in the field that are improving GBV and gender equality programming, really highlighting those at some of the high-level, global, regional, or crisis-specific meetings that go on. So we not only get the subject of GBV on the agenda, but we also highlight the work that's being done in field level and that ought to be better supported. And so some of the examples would be the annual Commission on the Status of Women, if you're thinking about a global event, or the United Nations General Assembly meetings in September, or maybe even not maybe, but almost certainly the high-level donor conferences that happen around a specific crisis. So I could just give as an example, when there was a few years ago, there was a high-level donor conference in Berlin on the Lake Chad Basin crisis. And so colleagues that worked on the Northeast Nigeria pilot roadmap were really able to bring the messages from that work to that donor conference. So that's an example of the kind of advocacy that can be done there. Other examples, once partners report every year, then we also do a collective progress report. So that has examples of good work that's been done, that makes recommendations for the coming year and so on. Could the global lead of the call to action get that global progress report out to all, to the heads of all the organizations that belong to it, who in turn share it with the right kind of messaging to field staff, right? What about building the call to action and the accountability into different trainings and missions? So if I was thinking, for example, about the REGAs, the regional advisors, we have the gender advisors, GenCaps, we have the protection advisors, ProCaps, we have missions that the guidelines reference group does. If call to action considerations and information on the framework were routinely incorporated into their training and missions, then that would give them a great tool, I think, and great to be able to, when they go out, to really be able to know they're speaking in the field to many entities that belong to call to action and have commitments under it, which can be supportive of the work. And then the last piece that we've come at in different ways so far is collaborating and disseminating on the, on the dissemination and institutionalization of the framework. So, can we together fund and organize trainings? Can we, to Yusuf's point, I guess, can we support development and distribution of the tool in different languages? Can we help mobilize resources, maybe in countries of focus? So again, this is a lot to cover, but we'll come back to each piece. The other thing that would be included under collective activities is something that I think we know takes more effort, more resources, but also may have greater benefit in the sense that you're really, along with the accountability framework, we're really getting in partnership with partners on the ground, our own and national partners, to really go deeper on call to action. If you looked at your strategy, the written strategy, this was under a section called higher investment. And that's really because it does take more organization, sometimes more resources, more support than some of the things I just referenced, which might be a little bit more standard. And so, for example, the EU organized workshops, as I said, they occurred across regions. There were 10 of them. And it was both raising awareness about call to action. It was bringing partners together with donors, because donors, of course, are a stakeholder as well. So it gave a platform for that kind of dialogue. It helped colleagues to get a better clarity on the relationships between the different structures and initiatives. So you have call to action, we have the Gbv AOR or subcluster. How does it fit together, and how can we use it to benefit our work overall? And in a number of the workshops, they identified a few things they really wanted to work on together and take forward as a result of the workshop. So that's one kind of thing. Another is more intensive still, I think, but again, you know, in a sense, the results may be greater because of all the upfront work that is put in. But we had two, as you know from last year, or maybe learning this year, there were 2 countries in which we piloted development of the call to action field level roadmap. And the idea was, can you take the global roadmap to a particular humanitarian setting and work with partners to develop their own country-specific or setting-specific roadmap that captures their priorities and identifies things they want to work on together, but does it as sort of a call to action multi-stakeholder effort, including donors. And we can come back to this because, as I said, we have so many colleagues here today who were part of it, but I think some of the benefits that those who were involved report is that it did improve engagement and dialogue with donors. It did help strengthen partnerships, not just with entities that are already in call to action, but also with government actors and also with CSOs. Some who may have already been involved through the Gbv subsector, some who were coming into this area for the first time. I think we also saw the beginnings of much stronger collaboration with the other clusters or sectors on how to mitigate the risk of GBV in food, shelter, and so on. And of course, it did provide, as I mentioned earlier, I think, more opportunities to advocate globally for the needs of these particular crises. So, part 3, expanding engagement with local actors. And national and local, I should say. And just to say, I wanted to call people's attention to the fact that in the updated roadmap, one of the new things is that we realized at last year's annual meeting that there are really a set of core principles that guide our work under the call to action. And so those are set out in the updated roadmap. And one of the core principles is, I'll read it because I think it really informs why the strategy is so important and moving it ahead concretely matters. The engagement, leadership, and participation of local organizations and local leaders, particularly women and women's organizations, is critical to effective humanitarian action. So that's become a core principle for the call to action. So with that in mind, it's like, okay, well, what can we do within our individual partner organizations to strengthen these partnerships? And again, think of these as initial suggestions that we can then further discuss when we get to the specific sections. We could, and it's come up already, which is great, make specific measurable commitments under the updated roadmap to support local organizations. As I said, localization is a key action under every outcome. So when we go to make our commitments under the global roadmap, it's like, how are we going to take that forward? We can, of course, bring our own local partners into call to action field initiatives from the very start, right? From the discussions about what they might look like, how they would be designed, how to take them forward. So this would include, for example, if a country is considering developing its own field level roadmap, then those discussions must include local partners and from the get-go, right? It would also be true for efforts to implement the accountability framework. Also, if you were having sort of more general awareness raising call to action workshops like the EU model. And then I think there's another bullet around increasing CSO membership in the global call to action by identifying and supporting interested national partners that may want to join the global initiative. I think when we come back to our discussion period, we'll have some comments on this, because I think there are opportunities and also real challenges for some of our national partners who belong to the global initiative, right? If we're going to do that in a meaningful way, that at a minimum we have to make sure we're providing the funding and logistics support for our national partners who are global partners to participate in these kinds of meetings and other meetings. And then what can we do across stakeholder groups around building and strengthening national partnerships, local partnerships? Again, together we could do it individually, we could collaborate, or we could do it individually to support CSO engagement in our field initiatives, but also we could do it together, come together and say, all right, how are we doing this across IOs, NGOs, states and donors, making sure that our national and local partners are fully involved, as I said, from the beginning, and not just involved, but developing, leading, and so on. Another thought was, speaking now about the global, speaking still about the global partnership, would it make sense to recruit at least 2 Southern-based coalitions or networks to become global partners? Maybe looking at those that have particularly strong participation of women's organizations, and work with them to identify mutually beneficial ways that call to action works for them as a network and also for their members. And again, we can come back to this, but some of what I was trying to get at when talking with colleagues about this is it can be a challenge and maybe not always beneficial if you're the only national entity in country X that belongs to the global call to action. Is there enough going on for you in terms of support and engagement to make that worthwhile? Or is it actually going to be more meaningful to have things done at the country level and or the regional level and or through networks that you're already part of? So that's the thinking behind that piece. Again, this third piece is something we can do inside our organizations, but we really need to commit to collectively as well, which is supporting CSO's engagement in our global events, if we have regional events for sure, and also in the annual partners meeting, of course. And I mean, there's 2 aspects to that I'm sure our own local partners will want to comment on when we get to that section, which is we've got to make sure that the funding and logistical support is there to be able to participate. And then if there's other steps that need to be taken in advance of meetings so that it's to maximize the value of participation, then we need to do that. And then sort of as a summary piece, it's continuing to learn from our CSO partners. As I say, this is the first field strategy. It needs to be a living document because we're going to learn a lot. And I think every step of the way, as we're consulting, working with, partnering with our CSOs, both current and perhaps future partners, we really have to get their input on how it's working, what adjustments may need to be made, make sure we're integrating that into our work planning. And we added one last point, which is making sure too that we as the call to action are also syncing up with the global Gbv area of responsibility or subcluster, because it is also deepening its commitments to localization. So I think we want to make sure we're in synergies there. So next steps. I think, as I said, the strategy's been out for a while, but realistically, people just haven't had time to comment on it. We've been all so busy. So today's chance is to get your feedback, take that on board, and then go back and finalize the strategy. So that's one thing. I think we want to identify new roadmap commitments that help us take the strategy forward, individual and collective. Make sure that what we agree to when the strategy is finalized, that we're integrating that into the work plans of our stakeholder working groups, the three stakeholder working groups we have, that it's in the work plan of who's ever the lead of the call to action, and that you also see it in the call to action steering committee work. As I mentioned, make sure it's a priority agenda item for annual partners meeting. Make sure we're clear on the resources partners may need to support their activities under the strategy, and then continue to work as we've been doing now, and I hope was exemplified here today, continue to work with the Accountability Framework Steering Committee as they move forward with perhaps focused countries. And I think that dovetails very nicely and should be done in concert with the call to action, which has so many benefits for all of us, I think. So I'm going to stop, oh, thank you, stop there with that, and let me think. I think I stopped my share now. I hope you all have sympathy for my technical challenge here. What I wanted to do before we went into the specific parts, right? Well, what we'll go ahead and do in a second is put these slides from part 1 back up. Manisha will do that, and we'll have a facilitated conversation about what we said about that, whether, as I say, something needs to be added, taken out, or whatever. For sure, use the chat, but we'd love you to bring the comments you made in the chat to the group so we hear voices, other voices too. But before we do that, I know that my colleague Richard Tenney from South Sudan also just wanted to offer a few overarching recommendations about the strategy before we leap into the very specific discussions on the different parts. So Richard, can I ask you to share a couple of your overarching recommendations with the group? Thank you.
Thank you so much, John.
Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, you did a very good job with this field implementation strategy. And I know everyone here may agree that this is the only backbone of the call to action if it has to succeed. Because as I could recall from my friend Yusuf, he was saying the boot on the ground. I remember he was talking about boot on the ground. So the boot on the ground would refer to having something that can be tangibly be seen by the beneficiaries, by the people who are affected by the GBV on the ground. And I think this is very important. So I would just like to make some few addition to some of the points that you have already raised. Yes, one of the things that I would indicate is that call to action, although it has really done a lot of groundwork, it has, make a lot of progress. I think still there's need for it to be pushed or to be given to be.
Hold on a second, Richard. Hey, okay, I think we solved the mute problem. I'm sorry, continue, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm saying that the government role should also be very clear. If you look at the strategy overall, we see the role of the government and the donors and the NGOs, the CSOs, the women-led. But we also, I think we will need to really, in the field implementation, have the role of the government more clearer so that we can be able to call on them and support us in the implementation of the call to action. If you look at some of the GBV issues across in African countries, for example, they are related to weaknesses in the legal framework. There's very weak legal framework, and really that are supporting the role of the women, the GBVs that are being perpetuated. So I think bringing in the government would be a very key thing that I think we should be able to look forward to incorporating even more stronger. I would also mention about the humanitarian affairs. I remember yesterday we talked about the global HRP, and I think still I could see that there is still a gap when it comes to how the call to action and the GBV issues are integrated into the humanitarian response at the country level. And I think that is an area that needs more strengthening. There's need for the Gbv subcluster, the need for protection cluster to take more lead, and they need to be supported by the humanitarian country leadership. If they don't get that kind of support, then it becomes a very big problem. So I think there's also a need there. For example, if you remember, or if you could recall, as we were mentioning yesterday, the issue of no specific objective that are being captured in the global HRP. The same thing also at the country office. So if you come up with an activity that is related to, I'm talking here about the country pool fund, and you come up with an activity that is related to your commitment and call to action, sometimes nobody recognize it, and maybe it would be, you would be told to get it out because it's not related to the full fund, or the SSHF, South Sudan Humanitarian Fund in this case. So I think that indicate that there's no knowledge about more focus on GBB as well as the call to action in this case. Yeah, the other thing that I also would like to mention is about expanding the engagement with the local actors. I think that is really, really very important. But what I've also, and I've seen is an issue, is about how do the headquarters of the INGOs communicate to the country offices. For example, you go to INGOs that is really very good in GBB and maybe a very prominent member of the call to action, but they are not aware of the initiative that are being done from the headquarter level, so you can be able to collaborate with them. So one of my requests and my appeal would be that the headquarters should actually be able to communicate to different country offices and say, we're in this. Can you identify or look for ways in which you can be able to participate and work together with local actors? I think that is really missing. So that will open an opportunity for the CSOs, especially the women-led organization, to have an access, not only about resources in terms of money, but also resources in terms of training, knowledge sharing, and capacity building, which is something that I think is missing. So yeah, we had also talked about the piloting of the call to action. Yeah. I mean the implementation of the field. I mean the field implementation in line with the piloting that was done in Northeast Nigeria and DRC. And I saw somebody mentioning this in the chat, saying that why could we not do it in other countries? So I know resources is a problem, but I would also recommend that with this field implementation strategy now, very well done. Thank you, John. I would suggest that we would be very happy if you could be able to roll out, especially the leader, the Canadian government now, to try to support and identify a few more countries that we could be able to try to come up with like kind of a consortium. Yep. And try to pilot this. How is the field implementation to go? How is it changing things? And with the support of the donors that are supporting this. Super. I will stop there, but I think this is good. It's a very good start with a good field implementation strategy in place, and with a buy-in from the donor and with the INGOs, working with the local actors, especially the women-led organization at the country level. I think we can be able to see results, hopefully in the next annual meeting. There you go. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. I think you hit on a number of points that we'll be able to go into as well when we go into our specific discussion. So thanks for that overview. Thanks for hitting on things like joint commitments. Thanks for hitting on the importance of perhaps additional field level roadmaps. Something that I think if we had a group of willing partners who could provide resources, support, and so on would be a great thing. Speaking personally, I think that'd be super. What I'm going to do now is ask Manisha to come on in, and what we're going to do is put the slides back up for part 1, which had to do with things we can do within our own organization. So those slides that are relevant to that discussion will be up, and then we'll go ahead and open it up for Q&A, comments, and the like. And so, Manisha, can I turn it over to you?
Hi, can you see my screen? I hope you can.
Yes, yes, we can.
Organizations, wonderful. Thanks so much, Joan. So as Joan said, we're going to come back to those 3 sections of the draft strategy that Joan was talking about. And we're first going to start with looking at the section on activities within our organization. And there's a poll up. I'm not sure if that's supposed to be there or not, about, is this your first call to action annual partners meeting? I don't, or maybe I'm the only one that sees that, so that's not a problem. I will, never mind, I'm gonna get that off, it's in my way. The joys of technology, here we go. Sorry about that. So what I am gonna encourage you to do is both use the chat function or the Q&A function, whatever is easiest for you. But really we wanted to get your feedback, as Joan said, about what are some of those things and activities within your organization that you feel you could be putting into the strategy that you think should be included? And are there things that are in the draft strategy now that you think we need to be changing or adjusting? And if anybody wants to take the floor, we would love for you to also speak. And if you've got video, I don't know if you can though, because it's a webinar, but happy to have you also speak as opposed to just putting things in the chat. And Mianda, Monique, I see you've got a question around the third part, and we will be coming to that in a little bit of time. Any feedback in terms of what we could be doing within our organizations and how that could work with the strategy, the draft strategy?
Manisha, do you see that Christine Appio raised her hand?
No, I'm trying to find the participants. Sorry, I've got, when I'm on my big screen, it's great, but thank you. There we go. Christine then, please. Thank you, Joe. I need my big screen, but you're seeing my big screen. That's where I'm struggling a little bit to get all my windows together. Christine, can I pass over to you, please? I'm trying to unmute you, Christine. I'm not sure why it's not working.
Okay.
Wonderful. Yes. Please go ahead.
So, thank you so much. I had the opportunity to read the draft strategy in advance, and what I think could be included, especially under dissemination by senior HQ leadership to field leadership, is also to ensure that it covers the regional leadership, because there are a number of organizations that have regional offices. And in the field, it mainly spoke, in the strategy, there was more reflection on the country. So I think that needs to be addressed. But also considering the fact that organizations in the field might have offices in the capital and different field offices. Usually, my experience with the pilot in Nigeria and DRC is that usually you find that the management in the field do not know about the call to action when they are partners, when their staff the management in the country office are not aware of the call to action or their commitments, yet their counterpart in the field, especially their GBV specialist, is aware. Perhaps I would imagine that could be a result of the engagement between the specialist and the HQ person. So, so that needs to be addressed, ensuring that really it's disseminated right from headquarters to regional, to the country offices, and to the field. I think that's what I have for this slide.
Wonderful. That's really helpful, Christine. And thank you very much for that suggestion. And I think having that regional level office inclusion there is very important indeed. I see Marcy, you've got your hand up. Can I ask you to go next, please?
Hi, I hope everyone can hear me, and
yes,
not
please go ahead.
my very tiny intern who's here with me as well. I just wanted to raise to this group a conversation that I started in the Q&A section. I really love the intention of the idea that that Joan raised around trying to translate the call to action to our field-based colleagues, for those of us who are working at the global level, to try to share both the general messages about sort of what the call to action is, who are the other partners in it, and and then that would be useful for advocacy purposes. But just thinking about what that would mean in practice, I think it would be very helpful to offer suggested advocacy actions, because I think it might be difficult and a bit abstract without some suggested guides for field-based staff to understand the power of the call to action and the ways that they might use it in their advocacy work, be it in the HNO and HNP process, in the cluster system, in the partnerships that they make, etc. And so I just wanted to sort of raise the idea of such a tool, and also to raise my hand as I make the suggestion that I would be happy to be a part of realizing such a suggestion, and just sort of open up the idea about practical things that we could create as a collective to help realize this important point.
Thank you very much, Marcy. That's a great suggestion, I think. And thank you also for taking this, the volunteering role of helping with that. That's really wonderful. I think that could really help for that global level roadmap and where we're going in terms of the strategy, and making that much more useful in terms of advocacy is a great idea and way forward. Are there others who've got some feedback or suggestions around what we should be doing in terms of activities within our organizations, in terms of promoting the roadmap or beginning the integration of the accountability framework, including call to action and the accountability framework in terms of the key field staff being able to convene and understand that better, or also in terms of the annual reporting? Christine, you've got your hand up. Is that from before, or is that this? Do you have another piece of input for us? Oh, I'm going to go to Sophie Price. Just one second, Sophie. I have to find you on my list and get your hand up. I see your hand is up, but I cannot find. Oh, there you are. Sophie,
Hi,
please go
everyone.
ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
So hello, everyone. I know some of you, but don't know all of you. So I'm from Canada, but field-based staff, posted to Nigeria. One of the things I wanted to raise was around the field staff point, and I don't know, I'm just going to give you a little story to maybe underscore my feelings on this one, or my ideas, where I think sometimes there's a really fundamental disconnect in truly understanding gender equality, or some of the things we talk about as transformative at the global level, when you disseminate it down to the very field level, like a deep field location in Nigeria. So one example for me was I was visiting a deep field location in Nigeria, and I was chatting with some protection staff and I was asking them what their main concerns were, and one of them raised gender-based violence, and particularly domestic violence. And then they went on to explain to me that if the women wouldn't anger their husbands so much, then they wouldn't beat them and the problem would be solved. So I think we have multiple layers of challenges. There are layers of challenges sitting at an HCT and understanding around the room and fully grasping what gender equality means and what we're actually trying to promote, even at the level of heads of UN entities, INGOs, donors, all of that. And then also getting right down to the field level. And I think some of that does relate to the value we place on this, which I'm not entirely sure is high enough. And I think certainly from a global perspective and sort of supporting down to the field level, I think reinforcing over and over that this is incredibly important, and if we'd like to see change, it needs to happen, and that we need to invest adequately in terms of training staff, not just on like a half an hour, here's your intro to gender equality and SGBV, and then we leave you to like do whatever it is you do, but to really fundamentally change the way people inside of our organizations look at this, I think is an important first step in order to make sure that we're providing adequate support when it comes to sort of that field level space. So sort of in terms of the activities within our organizations, I guess it's within all of our organizations, making sure first and foremost that all of our staff have a really good understanding and have buy-in to what we're actually trying to accomplish, I think is an important first step. So I guess that's really what I wanted to raise. And it kind of links to that bottom point.
Sorry, yeah, no, that's great, Sophie. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And I think it does underline the real challenge that we've got in terms of taking those commitments that we made at the global level and really getting down into the different levels of the organization and making sure that it's well understood how big a priority it is in terms of addressing GBV and addressing gender equality. I had Monique have her hand up a moment ago, but Monique, you put your hand down. But Monique, would you like to take the floor? Vous voudrez prendre la parole? Monique? Maybe I will allow you to speak again. Monique, peut-être que vous pouvez aller?
Looks like she's still muted, Manisha.
I'm trying to unmute her. It's got this like delay. It's very strange. I click it 3 times. Maybe it's 3 times lucky. If anybody else has the power to unmute, Monique, could you do that for me, please? Because it's not working on my computer right now. Well, maybe while we're figuring out how to get Monique to be able to speak, I've got Erin Patrick, who's also got a comment for us. Please, Erin.
Thanks, Manisha. So yeah, just really quickly, I on the last the last intervention, it got me thinking that I don't know the degree to which with the last roadmap, the larger global organizations that have operations across multiple country contexts, I don't know the degree to which a lot of them maybe deliberately worked with their country offices to actually craft their commitments. I'm sure that some did, but from my experience, I don't know that that was done really systematically or proactively. And so I'm wondering if that might be an opportunity here to kind of make call to action more tangible for field colleagues, is for an organization like a CARE or an IRC or, these big organizations with lots of country offices. Can we be more proactive and deliberate about actually reaching out to the country offices to see what sort of commitments they would like to make, what activities they're already doing that fit within the KAAs, et cetera, and craft at least some of the commitments that way. So that from the get-go, they're more tangible to the field level.
That's a great idea, Erin. Thank you. And it would be interesting to get maybe some feedback from some of you as to whether during the last roadmap, was there that consultation with your colleagues in the field? And if so, did it work? What were some of the challenges? What are perhaps some of the things that you learned from that effort that others might be able to benefit from? Monique, I'm going to try and get you on again. Although now I do not see you on my list at all, unfortunately. Hopefully we can get Monique going, but I saw Lena, you had your hand up as well. So let me see if I can unmute you.
Hello.
Excellent, Lena. Please go ahead.
So I just wanted to come in and agree with Erin, or suggest that how the commitments are crafted are very likely one of the sources of disconnect. I was not with the IRC when our commitments were crafted last time, so I can't really comment to that, unfortunately. But I do think it's important for us to talk about the hope that these commitments are really forward looking and not just commitments of things that we as organizations are already doing, while balancing that with the hard work that our field colleagues are already doing, and how we kind of think about those two pieces at the same time. I see there could be a lot of challenges in creating forward-looking commitments that might not reflect what our field colleagues are able to do or able to commit to, given their realities with funding, et cetera. So just want to think about how we make that balance a reality for people.
Super, that's really great, Lena. Thank you very much. I think that making that balance between the forward-looking but something that will be doable by field staff is important. And Milka Kahuna in the chat also suggested that we use the roadmap being launched in September as a way to have some coordinated communication from top leadership to staff across the organization, which I think, is a great other suggestion that we've got there. Is there anybody else who's got some further suggestions around what we can do within organizations, or things that we need to reflect in the draft strategy better about what we should be doing internally within organizations? Christine, you still have your hand up. Did you have another suggestion, or was that from before that you've got your hand raised?
From before.
Okay, then I'll lower your hand. I think that's been a really good start in terms of what we might be able to do in terms of improving the draft strategy. So very much looking at how do we cover the regional leadership, regional offices, making sure that we're able to translate what we're talking about at the global level much more into practical terms for field colleagues, making that in terms of an advocacy. And thank you very much, Marcy, for volunteering to take the lead there. Looking very much how we really reinforce these global messages and get the investment so that staff understand the importance of what we're talking about in the call to action roadmap and the accountability framework. And then looking also how organizations might be able to work internally with their colleagues in terms of really drafting commitments, but at the same time being sure that we're not overburdening them, but being ambitious at the same time and being forward-looking, and consider looking at the September launch of the roadmap as a way to get some strong messages from leadership to staff. Joan, did you want to come in here before I switch to the next one?
Yes, I was just going to say Marcy's point made me think, and maybe she'll be a little relieved to hear, that when we did the guide to developing country-level roadmaps, which is available on the Call to Action website, and the link will be sent to everybody, it has annexes that are things like engaging with donors about the call to action, important considerations in reaching out to our CSO partners, for example, messaging around the call to action with our own field colleagues. So just to say what we may be able to do with Marcy and others who are interested is go take a look at the resources that are in that guide and see if we can maybe use them more broadly. You know, great if we're developing additional country level roadmaps, hopefully it'll be useful, but perhaps we can use those pieces in other ways as well. So something we can make a note of going forward.
Great, and thank you to everyone for those great ideas in terms of that first section of the strategy in terms of activities within our organizations. We're now going to turn to activities across stakeholder groups. Now it's a little bit big, a little bit small, sorry, to put the whole thing into the screen very clearly. But really we're looking at firstly activities across stakeholder groups and then collective activities that we can be doing within or across stakeholder groups. And there we've got some of these ideas of multi-stakeholder field workshops to raise awareness and strategize, or to develop additional field level roadmaps. What are some of your thoughts in terms of what we can be doing across stakeholder groups as individual organizations or collectively? And I see that Jennifer Chase has written, I think it would be good to go beyond capitals and include the subnational level in countries, especially women-led organizations from the beginning, especially women-led organizations from the beginning. Jennifer, I think, is that for across stakeholder groups, or is that from the first bit in terms of what we can do within organizations? I will unmute you there, Jen, hopefully. I'm trying to unmute you, Jen.
Okay. Now
there you are. Yes, please go ahead.
No, it's just, I made that comment before you switched to the next slide. When we were still talking about where we're taking the initiative and the ideas around using the launch as a way to reach out and to reach beyond capitals was my proposal.
Sorry, I was going to say, Jen, since you have the floor, do you have any thoughts what we can be doing in this more collective approach in terms of across stakeholder groups or within stakeholder groups? Any suggestions from your side on that?
Well, I mean, I think we found that it was important in DRC and Nigeria to have buy-in from the beginning. You know, when we worked with the members of subclusters who then were able to call in actors from other stakeholder groups, that was one useful way to reach out to people. And I think everyone felt like having the donors on board and understanding call to action was very useful, and the government. I think the government and the donors were the stakeholders where it was felt that that's what made the call to action roadmaps unique compared to other initiatives, and very valuable. So, I mean, I think we heard from women-led organizations, for example, to have that opportunity to sit with donors and express and have their voice. So I think that's a role that UN agencies and INGOs who often have relationships to donors are good at bringing them together with the women-led organizations and with government authorities. And that could be local government authorities, or it could be bringing national level government authorities to more remote locations that they might not have been to before. That, I think all of those were very positive in the Nigeria experience.
Great,
Manisha,
sorry, Jennifer, that's great. Sorry, Joan, go ahead.
Manisha, may I make a technical thing?
Please.
So these are the slides that are meant to cover part 2, what we can do within and across stakeholder groups, but the top slide is actually for part 3. So is there some way to retrieve the slide that begins with advocacy to integrate call to action into key humanitarian field guidance and the like? You know, HNOs, HRPs, all that stuff.
Give me a second. I have to open my PowerPoint because it's
okay.
not ones. But while I'm doing that, Christine, you've got your hand raised. Can I ask you to go, please?
Yeah, thanks. I was just thinking about Erin's comment around getting country level staff or even subnational level staff involved in the conversation about making our commitments for this next round. But I also think once those commitments have been finalized, it could be really powerful to encourage colleagues from different call to action members at country level to come together and share what their global commitments are, how that fits in with the broader country level strategy, and maybe even invite donors to be part of that conversation. Because I think it could be really powerful to just advance the conversation in that way, in a really, practical and tangible method.
I like that, Christine, and I would say, since donors are call to action stakeholders, to the extent that we can always act as that multi-stakeholder group, for sure to include them. I think that's great.
Thank you very much, Christine. Joan, is this the one that's on my screen now? Collective activities within across stakeholder groups, and you've got advocacy to integrate call to action in key humanitarian field guidance strategies. I'm gonna guess that's the right one.
Oh, there I am talking away. It is the right one. And just to remind colleagues, this was the slide that was about things we can do at the global level to make sure, or to advocate with our field colleagues to ensure that call to action and the accountability framework appear in these key pieces of humanitarian field guidance, in key field meetings, etc. That's what this is.
Super.
Sorry, that was my mistake, I am sure.
No problem. I've got Astrid who wants to chime in. Astrid, did you want to take the floor? She's saying it's very important in DRC to have local actors in the room with government actors, to have local and national government meet, to have local actors meet with donors, creating a space that had not existed before of direct contact between actors to discuss GBV requirements and challenges. But Erin Patrick also pointed out that we may need to think about not relying on in-person workshops and launches as our key awareness raising tools, and that we may need to think creatively about other methodologies given the challenges of traveling these days. And then we've got Virla Triquet. I'd agree, but unfortunately we felt we lost a bit of momentum after the launch in Nigeria because it was complicated because most of the advocacy work took place in Abuja while we were implementing in the Northeast. So I would definitely agree with the need to have engaged government stakeholders in the Northeast with an emphasis on localization. And then we've got Naomi who says, another point is cultural context too. I can imagine very hardly to have the right networking in the DRC without physical meetings. And that we do need to do more to link up, create more communication. Naomi, would you maybe want to take the floor and give us a little bit more of your experiences in DRC? Maybe while you think about it, Naomi, I've got Liz Pender. Liz, can I pass it to you, please?
Sure. I want to explore opportunities for better collaboration between the donor community and women-led organizations, but I feel like it might be taking us down a different discussion, and I'm wondering if Noemi wanted to speak to comment on the previous discussion point.
Thanks, Liz. Naomi, would you like to take the floor? Oh, wonderful. I will unmute you, hopefully.
Unmute myself.
Wonderful, thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you for the floor. Yes, for me, in DRC, it was very few occasions for women-led organization in particular, so now I link also with Liz, to talk with everyone, to really get in the same room of the humanitarian coordinators of the Ministry of Gender, if it's not a field visit. So, and it also created the linkage with the decentralized operation, because we had this big gathering in Kinshasa. Was the thing that was requested by partner, but there was this huge perception that it was quite unique. And if you listen to a few women organizations, they will say that the added value of the call to action, that they are now back to the table, because there was so many bilateral relations. So many strong organizations in their places in Ituri or in South Kivu and North Kivu and in 2-3 regions, they weren't able to access easily the planning, the high-level decisions making thing. So that's just the thing that I can underline. Over.
Super, thank you so much, Naomi. Christine, and maybe Liz, I'll come back to you, but since Christine is talking about CSOs again, in terms of facing immense challenges in accessing financial resources to implement commitments under the roadmap, can donors work together to initiate some kind of pooled funding where CSOs, especially women-led organizations, who normally find it difficult to access pooled funds and can't access funding from traditional donors, could access such resources? Strategic partnerships approaches in funding, example, when donors launch call for proposals, could ensure, for example, that INGOs bid jointly with CSO counterparts. If this is part of the funding agreement, then it would make it easier for CSOs to implement their commitment. And Liz, your point is linked to that. So Liz, did you want to come in now? And then I've got Monique, hopefully, that we can have speak after you, Liz. And then actually, Christine, if you want to speak as well, please let me know. Liz, can I pass to you?
Yeah, thanks, Manisha. So I think, and I really would welcome the perspective of Christine and others on this, but, you know, we've talked a lot about needing to expand how we look at donors as not just donor states, particularly when it comes to our efforts to increase and ensure meaningful access to funding, particularly for women-led and women-focused organizations. And I'm wondering if there's an opportunity here for some sort of action across stakeholder groups where we have some sort of a task team or some sort of effort or action that includes donor states, IOs and INGOs that are working as donors, and women-led organizations that are meant to be able to access some of this challenging funding through IOs and INGOs, so that, you know, on the one hand, women-led organizations can be quote unquote at the table and have that meaningful access to the higher level donor states, but also so that the donor states who often earmark funding to IOs and INGOs with the assumption that it'll then be accessible to women-led organizations are have a little bit more visibility on how that funding is being used, and then that group can collectively work together with the ultimate goal of increasing access of women-led organizations to funding, whether it's through IOs or directly to the donor states, but also have that access to donor states from an advocacy point of view. Over.
Super, thanks, Liz. And I think that's a great kind of way of figuring out how do we make sure that women-led organizations have access to more funding, but also that access to donors for for advocacy. And that point that was raised before by Naomi about women-led organizations being at the table really highlights something that could be, that has been and could be an even greater impact at the field level or country level because of call to action. Astrid from the Gbv AOR also said that a funding mechanism to fund local actors could be potentially a game changer for the call to action, and it had come up consistently in field implementation to date. Ellen had added that she fully agrees with what Christine said about discussing implementation of commitments at field level. It was identified in many of the workshops as a useful topic for the next country regional meetings should they take place. Unfortunately, ECHO could only organize one series, but this also showcased interest to exchange much more. We'd therefore be in favor of these workshops to be included in the strategy and indeed build on the workshops and learning also around practicalities. As Karen flagged above, even though we did regularly share updates on the workshops to the call to action through the steering committee, working groups, etc., improved communications is always an area of improvement, especially when a relatively large number of workshops are organized during a short period of time with a lot of variables. I'm going to come back to some of the chat functions, but Monique, I've got you and then I've got Fatima. So Monique, hopefully this time we can unmute you, or you can unmute yourself, please. You're unmuted, Monique. Please go ahead.
Merci beaucoup pour la parole. C'est Monique Mianda de la RDC dans la province du Kassai-Oriental, en Bujimaï précisément. Je suis secrétaire exécutif au réseau Femmes et Développement, un réseau constitué des organisations dirigées par les femmes. Oui, je voudrais aborder par rapport au call to action en rapport avec les prestations des organisations dirigées par les femmes, que c'était bien parti. À travers la localisation, les organisations dirigées par les femmes se sont mis au travail. Elles ont compris le bien fondé de participer à l'amélioration des conditions de vie des communautés, surtout les femmes et les filles. Mais je voudrais un peu revenir par rapport au Grand Berguin parce que c'est le sujet du jour. Le Grand Berguin qui était lancé depuis 2016, qui est un accord unique entre le plus grand donateur et les agences humanitaires qui se sont engagés à améliorer l'efficience et l'efficacité de l'action humanitaire. Maintenant, je voudrais aborder en rapport avec le 3e chapitre du Grand Berguin, qui est d'améliorer la prestation. Avec cet appel à l'action, moi je pense que renforcer les liens verticaux des organisations dirigées par les femmes avec la coordination humanitaire, c'est un atout pour s'assurer de la pérennité et la durabilité du call to action. Comment est-ce que vous pouvez renforcer les liens par rapport à l'appel à l'action pour que cet objectif, le 3e, qui est lié à l'amélioration des prestations, soit vraiment réaliste? C'est par rapport à ça que je voudrais intervenir, comme nous sommes en train de parler du Grand Berguin, donc de penser de ne laisser personne à côté, d'intensifier les relations, la communication des organisations locales avec la coordination humanitaire. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monique. J'ai pas entendu toutes les choses que vous avez dit, and I'm going to switch to English to make it easier. But I think that point about how are we really reinforcing support for local organizations and women-led organizations is a very important one. And we will be coming back to that in terms of the 3rd pillar of the strategy shortly. And so we can explore that in more detail. So I think that's very important. Twitter was suggested by Naomi as potentially an area where we could invest more as an alternative methodology for these larger networking, larger meetings in person. And that potentially could give more access to high-level platforms by women-led organizations and multi-partner meetings. Fiona from Trocare also suggested that this cross-stakeholder group is essential and should include women-led organizations in addition to donors, international organizations, and INGOs. And Liz has suggested having a collective commitment to increase access of women-led organizations to funding. And it has to include more than just donors and states. And Florence was talking about showing the importance of localization and women-led organizations and making sure that they're part of the objectives of the roadmap and ensuring that we can remove the blockages or the obstacles that exist now for them to get funding. So that's an area where I think we've got a lot of commonality and purpose is how do we make sure that we get more funding to local organizations and what can be done in that sense. Micah from IMC, I know we raise this every time we meet, but a serious challenge relates to the nature of women-focused organizations. Those committed to gender equality are often explicitly political or at least viewed as such, therefore presenting a barrier to their participation in humanitarian forums and also a barrier for partnership with INGOs. It would be very helpful to have some high-level policy guidance on how to navigate this and to set expectations for GBV donors and implementers, not only to work with local organizations, but to work with feminist organizations. I had somebody who had their hand up and now they've lowered their hand. And Joan, you're calling me on WhatsApp. I hope everything's okay.
Everything's fine. Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to. No, did you say Fatima had her hand up?
Yes, but I've lost Fatima. Fatima, can I unmute you and let you speak, please?
Hello.
Hello, Fatima. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Just to add my voice to the conversation around women-led organizations' participation within the call to action, and I think just as previous speakers and also based on the comments that had been sent to the chat box, it's obvious that funding has been a very great impediment to the women-led organizations reaching or meeting the commitments that they have actually made in the call to action. And that is because every time we meet, we hear them mentioned as one of the challenges or as the greatest challenges, the inability of the call to action to actually link them up to funding, taking into consideration or bearing in mind that it has a great base of donor governments and organizations. However, still women-led organizations do not feel as if their belonging to such a forum has actually increased their access to funding, thereby making them more visible and making it possible for them to attain their commitments. We all know that commitments cannot be commitments unless you are able to achieve them. So it continues to be a very big challenge. So it's good for the voices of women-led organizations to be heard and for donors to actually go beyond just, including just mildly, work with local actors without follow-up. Because what we see is that there is no strong language in the need for international organizations to actually work with local actors. And I think that is the message. For us to come out strongly, to make it a criteria or to even make it mandatory that international organizations need to work with local actors. Or then we now begin to make the role of women-led organizations more prominent within the call to action initiative. And if I can link it up to also participation of women-led organizations and how to ensure that they are visible, I think it's not just about participation. We also have to come back to the issue of funding. If you're looking at participation in numbers and we're talking about events happening at regional and global level, then it has to be a strategic focus to ensure that women-led organizations have access to funding, not just to implement, but also to be able to attend such global events, not at the discretion of the organizers, quote unquote, because if I have the funds available at my organization, I should be able to attend all those meetings, you know, and be able to consistently follow these meetings. But when it is left, you know, to be selected or not to be selected, then it becomes something that is not consistent, and then following up of such events becomes an issue. And one important thing is when you come back from such events, I think funding should be made available for women-led organizations that have participated in such events to actually step it down. Within the call to action actors, there should be those organizations that should be able to take that responsibility. Probably just an example to say, okay, IRC in Borno, in Nigeria, would support the step down of a certain event that has happened at global level, that has had in attendance local actors, so that that gap is being bridged between the global as well as the field level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fatima. And I think that's a really important point, is that it shouldn't be up to whoever's organizing it, but it should really be up to who are the organizations locally that are interested in trying to push things forward, and that we're really making that attempt to support organizations. There's a few more things that are coming out on the chat in terms of how we're using women-led, I've lost it, sorry, one sec, oh dear. Lots of things have come up and now give me a minute, sorry. I like having a big screen where I can see everything. Here we go. Liz was saying, yes, we use the terms women-led organizations or women-focused organizations as if they're monolithic, and we need to be more considerate of the nuances between them. There is also a suggestion from Unicef wondering whether or not we need to unbundle the grouping of local CSOs with NGOs generally in view of the challenges that they're facing with localization and the funding of local CSOs on the ground. And Oswald is saying it's mainly local women-led organizations that have difficulty accessing funding in the humanitarian context. I'm talking about grassroots community organizations run by women. Many do not meet the organizational criteria required by donors, and partnership with these types of organizations should be required. And I see, Liz, you've got your hand up, and maybe we can try to pick up that point and that challenge that Micah raised before in terms of local organizations not being seen by donors or INGO as being humanitarian, and therefore having some challenges in terms of funding. So what can we do there, and what can we do to make sure that we're supporting women-led organizations in terms of being able to really take the call to action roadmap forward, and also in terms of coming up with some more of those collective activities for stakeholders within and across stakeholder groups. Liz, can I pass to you, please? And then after this, I'm going to try and shift us to the last section, because I think we're going to have a lot of conversation there about supporting local NGOs, and we're already starting to get there. But Liz, can I ask you to go, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I don't want to co-opt Micah's point. It was actually Micah's point, and I was agreeing with it and certainly supportive of it. What I also want to, I think Fatima was making some points that I found really, really compelling and really important. And, it does, I think the real-time accountability partnership, we mentioned it yesterday, but we've created this task team to develop these funding models. And I'm finding that all of the, some of these points are really, I think, going to inform that work. But I think it's important for all of us to remember that accessing funding isn't a singular process. And, we can't, I think one of the things that I, as one donor, have noticed is that as much as we still donors need to direct more funding towards Gbv programming, we also would benefit from a higher degree of proactivity among senior leadership of including, you know, local organizations, less so women-led organizations, because they do tend to be really strong advocates, but particularly senior leadership of IOs and INGOs to be more proactive about asking for GBV money. And when they submit budgets to donors that have, I mean, just an example, I was reviewing a proposal 2 days ago that had a budget of which 98% of it went to health and 1% went to GBV and the rest went to kind of indirect costs. And that's the kind of thing that we're grappling with. And when that happens, when senior leadership of NGOs and IOs minimize and deprioritize their own GBV funding budgets, when country directors or country reps make those determinations, then that affects the amount of money that then theoretically should be accessible to women-led or women-focused organizations. And just to reinforce that it is, again, it's really complicated, and I don't, and as we discussed yesterday, I don't see that there is going to be one single solution. And I feel like we're sort of talking about this as if there is one sort of a panacea or one solution, and there's not. So I would really encourage and welcome feedback to the RTAP Global Steering Committee for some of these thoughts, and perhaps we can use those to help us inform our discussions and tools that we're trying to develop around creating a range of funding models that ultimately will result, inshallah, and I hope, in increased access to funding for women-led organizations. Over.
Anisha?
Thanks very much. Hi, Joe. Go ahead.
I wanted to share 2 comments that came from our colleague Geeta Anani, who's the executive director of ABAD. She was hoping to join and then couldn't due to circumstances she's dealing with. But there were 2 points she wanted to make in regard to this. And one was really emphasizing the need for cross-working group collaboration, whether it's in work plans or maybe even around commitments that are made by a group under the new roadmap that support taking this strategy forward. So doing so in very concrete ways, even considering some kind of group of partners that makes a specific commitment. And then maybe going back to Marcy's point, making sure we're clear on what resources, financial for sure, but others as well, that are needed to actually implement this thing. So just wanted to share those 2 points from our colleague at ABAD who couldn't be with us.
Super, thank you very much, Joan. And I think there were some very good suggestions in terms of how we can work across stakeholder groups, but also make sure that we're supporting women-led organizations and local organizations. There was that very specific suggestion around how do we make sure that we're working with donors to really get funding much more to local and women-led organizations, maybe trying to also separate out local CSOs from NGOs to see if then we can really make sure money's going towards local NGOs. And there was some support for having this cross-stakeholder group bringing in women-led organizations, NGOs, donors, international organizations as a way to really put things into practice on the ground and making sure that the commitments are being put forward. We've already started moving a little bit in terms of how do we make sure we've got more engagement and support for local actors. And I'm hoping you're seeing the right slide. Joe,
yes. I did not screw up this time, Manisha. You're looking at the right thing. We also had a colleague, Amani, from Syria Relief and Development, who, we only have a handful of national or local partners that belong to the global call to action. And I think, we've struggled with what, and they have struggled with what is actually useful to them in being a global partner, right? And how can it be made, how can it be made beneficial? And so I was going to ask Amani, if she's with us, if she wanted to make a few comments. I know she had a few reflections that she wanted to share to kind of kick off this part of the discussion. So coming from the perspective of a national organization that is a partner in the global call to action. So Amani, are you able to do that?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi everyone. good morning and good afternoon, good evening. So I'm Imani, I'm the Regional Director for Sierra Relief and Development, as Joan said, and I'm also a doctor of public health student at Johns Hopkins, focusing on health equity and social justice, which ties in a lot with what we've been talking about so far. So I just wanted to kind of, it's been nice listening to reflections. And I think what I've been talking about sort of offline with Joan and others with the call to action is really the macro perspective in terms of the call to actions field strategy. And what we've been grappling with as an organization, in addition to many others in the region with the Syria or MENA context, is really seeing how it's gained traction perhaps with other pilot countries, but for other countries and regions where there isn't a national roadmap, it's a bit different. I think Marcy accurately emphasized it's quite abstract actually. It's very clear that there's an upward conversation in terms of INGOs, UN, donor, but it's difficult if the end goal is to have so many of these commitments materialize at the field level. How can you have this happen if these agencies aren't really part of the conversation? And I think it's really about, we've struggled to figure out how we have an added value as an actor, but also what call to action's added value is to us. And I think listening in, obviously, we all know Gbv and emergencies as a focus globally is essential. There's no question about that. But I think when we talk about elements such as the accountability piece and the technical aspects, a lot of sort of individuals at the regional level argue that, well, they rely on the Gbv subcluster, they rely on the Gbv AOR and reference those, and the call to action is much more sort of meta at the meta level for them. And I'm not speaking on behalf of any other agencies besides our own, but in offline conversations, I mean, really, it seems that the call to actions dynamic is similar to many others global platforms where it's very UN-centric, INGO-centric, and donor-centric, and it's not to criticize, any individuals within these institutions. In fact, there are many allies, but I think it's just, there isn't much buy-in to a system that's perpetuating so many of these inequalities that we face on the ground simply in a different form. And I think right now, sort of, especially with the time, kind of with all of the events around us, we see what's happening, and we really have to consider our positionality in this issue and this type of platform in sort of perpetuating a lot of these forms of inequality. We can't talk about this without talking about racism, the hierarchies, the lack of ownership. And so really, if we're talking about accountability in terms of the Gbv framework, from a technical aspect, we also need to address the accountability from that macro perspective and how many agencies are leading these platforms and seeing how their localization agenda, if there is one, fits into this. And it's really how diversity fits into this, women of color, women from these communities. I know people have sort of debated women-led, women-focused, and I think you get the point of what I'm talking about. And I know it might mean we have to have uncomfortable conversations, and agencies may need to self-reflect and also acknowledge sort of their part in this global platform. I think we really hope that this is sort of a timely moment to figure out, perhaps the call to action is more realistically applied in certain countries of operation where there's the opportunity to do a national roadmap. And beyond that, it might not be as feasible. It really is about sort of what's realistically being able to be accomplished. And given right now that it has very little actors sort of beyond the UN, INGO, donor trifecta, I think it's best to be honest in sort of portraying and understanding sort of what is the purpose of this platform, and how does it really tie in with the broader sort of notion around localization. I know, and this is sort of my last point, I'll try to wrap up, is, we've already talked about how the funding piece is not sort of part of call to action's mandate, but how is it tying what local partners, and I think many have already mentioned this, is they're inextricably linked. And I think Angelina mentioned yesterday, we see the pledging is happening at the global level. We see it happening in Oslo, we see it happening in Geneva and Brussels and whatnot, depending on what context you work in, but where is it on the ground? And so I'll stop there, and I hope I mean this in the most constructive way, is really just understanding sort of the feasibility of some of these platforms. Otherwise, partner agencies on the ground are extremely stretched thin with kind of all of the other sort of initiatives that they're a part of, and just the practicality around it really needs to be considered. So I'll stop there, and thanks, Joan and all.
Thank you very much, Imani. And I think those were some very excellent points that really do require a lot of reflection. And I think, as you said, how much is call to action kind of fitting in with all the localization conversations. And I think it's one of those general challenges we have in our sector is that we create initiatives, but we don't necessarily make the links and ensure that they're really fitting along other commitments that may have been made in a very consistent way that we go about it. But I do think we really need to be thinking about what does this mean for local organizations, and how is that, as you said, when you're already stretched on the ground and you're not getting access to funding, what does that mean, and is it something that's realistic? Which also links to a question that Monique had asked in terms of, from your intervention, Joan, about that stage of really deepening and enlarging the collaboration with local organizations. You know, how are we going to be able to do that, and what is the process? And we also have to think about the empowerment of local organizations, which Monique said is, you know, in terms of GBV protection, they're playing an important role. And given that GBV is a silent pandemic, I would love to hear from some of you in terms of what are your thoughts around how do we make sure that we've got that greater engagement with local organizations. We've talked in the previous session about having sort of stakeholder groups trying to support them, but how do we make sure that we've got that representation that is of all the actors working on GBV, and making sure that we bring their views in, and that it's not being seen as a place where women-led organizations may not be having the same space and voice that other international organizations do. Erin has said, totally agree with many, think this is where the accountability framework can come in handy. If call to action is still too meta or too vague, the accountability framework is meant to be operationalized specifically at country, office, or emergency specific level. The original idea behind RTAP was what would happen if all actors need to work on GBV and emergencies, do it collectively under an agreed set of guiding principles. It was always meant to be done at the country level from the start. So perhaps that's more the place to start. Oh, sorry, Erin totally agreed with Amani. Not many, it was a typo, but I think that's a good point. Is the RTAP, or sorry, now the accountability framework, potentially a much more practical way to engage numerous actors working on GBV at the country level, so that we're not looking just at sort of this global, vague, potentially level of the call to action, but really getting much more concrete on the ground? Any thoughts? I know it's getting towards the end of the day for some of us in some places.
Could I ask, in follow-up to what Amani said, and thinking about, I mean, Fatima makes a good point about the work yet to be done on the global, as we take the field level roadmaps forward. You can see the field, you can see the value, if we do it the right way and sustain it, that comes with those very country or setting specific initiatives, right? I'm curious, and I take Amani's point on sort of some of the issues around, all the issues actually, at the global piece. I'm wondering whether our CSO colleagues have a view on whether we should retain in the strategy the notion of recruiting coalitions, regional coalitions perhaps, of local organizations, or particularly women's organizations, to be at the global level, to feed into that thinking and planning and working. Does that make sense, even as we try to strengthen efforts with national partners where they are in their settings? Is there value to that, or what's your reaction to that? How do we keep the effort at the global level grounded in the reality of the work at the field level?
Super, thanks, Joan. And just to call attention, Amani agreed with Erin and think that that's part of the next phase, where the call to action can really consider operationalizing it as suggested in terms of using the accountability framework. And Liz clarified that the full purpose of the accountability framework is to provide actual practical guidance and structure to be adapted at the field or country level to change the system to be more accountable to women and girls, and to realize the objectives of call to action. And Grace has noted that women's organizations we have partnered with have indicated that their organizations are not viewed as humanitarian enough, yet they are responding to address GBV and broader protection risks in their communities every day. The call is for donors and INGOs to support their work, and one way would be to have equal partnerships with INGOs that recognize their role and include components that resource their work for most part, which is underfunded, and remove the barriers the humanitarian system places for their leadership and decision-making at national level. And that's something that we were talking about in the previous point, is really how do we make sure that this desire or necessity by donors, whether they be government, INGOs, or UN agencies, to have these humanitarian organizations get the funding, how do we get past that when we're seeing these local actors and women-led organizations responding to GBV on a daily basis? And then picking up on Joan's question from before is, do we want to be looking at getting women-led organizations at the regional level as bringing them into the call to action and helping support some of the commitments so that that country level work can be taken forward? Grace, did you want to maybe take the floor and further expand on your points? Since no one's raising their hands, I'm going to start asking. Maybe, no? I've allowed you to speak, Grace.
Okay, oh, okay, you've allowed me. Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, so definitely I think one of the experiences that we've had in a partnership that focused on capacity strengthening for humanitarian work is that we do have strong women organizations that are doing a range of things. I think the experience we have is at community level, the divide between, you know, humanitarian and development it does not exist. It's within our sector that we have these clear divisions, but yet, you know, the work they do is cuts across, you know, protection as well as addressing GBV. And it is true that there is a desire for them to, you know, build up and strengthen their skills as community-led organizations in a range of areas. You know, GBV, we also have accountability in emergencies. But you know, the barrier that they face is that you know, funding is very project-based, and then when we ask for, you know, leadership roles at national level, we'll be looking at organizations through the lens of, do they have systems that purely fit in our international or UN agency humanitarian lens? So the kind of due diligence or the kind of you know, systems and governance structures that we're looking for are the ones that mirror the kind of you know, sector we are in, and that is not the case for them. So I think the call for us is really for us to change our mind shift. And they do acknowledge they could have you know, some gaps in some areas, but they still do the work anyway, and very effective, very timely, and really able to you know, to save lives as you know, on the ground, very you know, timely, in a timely manner. And so I think that's the reflection that I have for us as we go forward is, you know, when we talk about even the networks of women organizations that will be looking to support at national level, is that for us to broaden and embrace the civil society movement that is already working on GBV at national level. And from that, we will start seeing certain strengths and skills that are already within that you know, network of civil society organizations, who include women-led organizations for a large part for, you know, GBV and protection, but not really to try and, you know, create additional barriers by using a lens of we're looking for humanitarian women-led organizations. In some areas, that is the case, but broader than that, I think we're going to look at a bigger movement of women organizations that are already influencing policy and work around GBV at national level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grace. And I realize I missed a few earlier comments that kind of speak to what you were saying in terms of the financing issues. Micah had said, from IMC was saying, my organization and often UN coordinating agencies are very conservative in how they interpret humanitarian principles. And this is in the interest of not upsetting the government. But what it means is that working with organizations that are working in GBV, it becomes much more challenging. Whereas in the case of IMC, they're seen as then not seen as working with organizations that are not as principled on the humanitarian side, that will often take on any sector of work with funding, which then as a result, you're continuing to sideline activist women's organizations that could really make a change. And there was a suggestion about, as you said, Grace, this division between humanitarian and development makes it quite challenging for us in terms of where the money goes. Malika had noted it's at the level of leaders of regional initiatives and project coordinators that most of the awareness needs to take place, and that it's a critical challenge for organizations, whether they're UN or INGOs, this is from Christine, of prioritizing GBV within their organizations when developing proposals. Could donors help reinforce this? Asked Christine. For instance, individual donors could set a benchmark on percentage of funding that needs to go towards GBV in the call for proposals, instead of just leaving it at the discretion of organizations. And Milka agreed with Grace and said, I think it helps that the new roadmap frames things differently, i.e. instead of humanitarian actors, quote unquote, it talks about actors working in humanitarian contexts, which includes women-led organizations and CSOs, which might help us begin to change the discourse. I also realized there's been a huge number of excellent ideas, and we are getting close to 5 o'clock or 11 o'clock in some places. I think there's a great amount of ideas and suggestions of what we can put into the draft strategy, particularly in terms of reflecting on what are some of the practical ways we can put call to action into practice. And Fiona has said, really helpful intervention, Amani. I think in addition to the practical steps to ensure call to action delivers on its objectives, there are also deeper reflections needed on these points, absolutely. We will take all those suggestions and think about how we bring them into the strategy, but I think a lot of those broader reflections that you raised, Amani, we can also be looking at in our meeting tomorrow when we come together. Yeah. But huge thanks, because I think we've had a great number of suggestions in terms of how we can better support local organizations, whether it's through more funding, making sure it's not so project-based, trying to get away from this humanitarian division that we have when women-led organizations and local organizations are working on GBV, potentially having donors commit to a pooled fund that local organizations and women-led organizations could really access, and really thinking about looking at how can we be honest about making sure that the call to action platform is really inclusive of those organizations. Joan, you didn't get a particular answer to the regional question you had, but hopefully that will come up, and I am going to pass back to you, Joan, for the last couple minutes.
Okay, first of all, thank you all for the participation, for the discussion, for the input into the strategy. My guess is when we take all of this, see what, and maybe even tomorrow's discussion as well, and revise the strategy. For those who are really interested, there'll be one last chance to look at it, I think. But for me, as I was listening to the conversation, I was really thinking about it, not just in terms of the strategy, which is sort of what we were discussing today, but really what it says about what we can make around very concrete commitments under the new roadmap, particularly in support of localization that, as I said before, now cuts across the whole roadmap. So for me, it was taking a lot of the good points that were made, which will be shared back with you, that in part get rolled into the strategy, but I really hope inform our commitments. And I think it was exciting to think about the accountability framework's relationship to today's discussion too. So big thanks to everybody. I know this is a tough way to communicate. Would that we were all together. And I would just make one last request for tomorrow. Tomorrow, we're really going to look at the updated roadmap, the new roadmap that will be launched in September. And so it was shared with you. And if you can make sure you have that updated roadmap in front of you tomorrow, that would be great, because what we're going to look at is each of the 6 outcomes in the updated roadmap and talk about how we can best implement them. Again, I think we got some great ideas today, had some yesterday too, but if you have that roadmap in front of you when we go outcome by outcome, that might be an added and good resource. So with that, I think we will thank everybody 100-fold. I almost feel like we need a virtual energizer in this, but I mean, I don't know how to do that. So pretend we had one. You were all really so engaged. We're so grateful, and have a good day or evening. And thank you all very, very much. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you, Joan.
Now, I don't really know how to leave. Oh, over there. Bye.